24 hours after the U.S. slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Canada is hitting back. At midnight tonight, the Liberals say they're putting 25% tariffs on another $29.8 billion of U.S. goods. That includes $12.6 billion of American steel, as well as $3 billion of aluminum. There's also a list of $14.2 billion worth of other goods, which includes computers, sports equipment, and cast iron products. The Finance Minister and the Premier of Ontario are headed to Washington tomorrow to meet with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. But will it be enough to hit the brakes on an escalating trade war? Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Hi, David.
You talked to Howard Lutnick quite a bit. You text with Howard Lutnick quite a bit. What are the texts and conversations in advance of the meeting tomorrow? Where are things?
I had a nice chat with him this afternoon, actually very cordial. We talked about the meeting tomorrow in Washington. We talked about the decision that the government made today to impose dollar-for-dollar tariffs on steel and aluminum and other consumer goods so that we could get to a dollar-for-dollar response. I reiterated to Secretary Lutnick that this was entirely something that we would hope to cease, that we didn't think it was particularly constructive for them to apply these unjustified, unreasonable tariffs on our steel and aluminum industries. They knew we were going to respond, but that I hope we could get to a position where we can lower the temperature and figure out how to get to their April 2nd date for their reciprocal tariff decisions, where we can respect the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States and remove all these tariffs.
They must know all of this by now, though, right? And I saw Peter Navarro saying we need to lower the temperature and Canada needs to drop the rhetoric. And I found that a little bit puzzling as the U.S. has really initiated everything that has happened. So, I mean, what do you hope tomorrow accomplishes? Do you get the aluminum and steel completely off, or what's the goal of that meeting tomorrow?
Yeah, so I don't think I'm unrealistic to think that that these tariffs will come off tomorrow. American industry and American consumers will feel the effect of these tariffs that their own government put into place. I'm hopeful that we can, with the Commerce Secretary, arrive at a conversation that would sort of be, okay, instead of every week putting this on, taking this off, threatening to do this, changing direction. It's very disruptive for business people. It's workers are understandably, on both sides of the border, I imagine, workers are certainly in Canada are feeling this uncertainty. It's not constructive for consumers in Canada or the United States. So let's agree on a process that looks at all of these issues together. If they have an understandable national security concern around their own steel and aluminum industries, Canada should be a reliable, safe source of steel and aluminum for industries as important in the United States as their defense industry. So I understand that. That was my conversation with Secretary Lutnick today. We have joined the previous Biden administration in applying tariffs on electric vehicles from China, steel and aluminum from China. They're dumping them onto the North American market. I said to the Commerce Secretary again, I said, if you want us to work with you and the Mexicans to ensure that the Chinese aren't taking advantage of the North American economy, we're all in. Like, let's have that conversation, but stop tariffing one another. Ours are in response. I think we didn't start this, but we're not going to sit idly by while they threaten sectors of our economy as important as the ones that they're targeting.
Well, and that tariff alignment on electric vehicles from China has led to retaliation on key agricultural sectors of the Canadian economy. So you're paying the price for aligning with the United States and their national interests and our national interests. But, you know, this meeting is happening because, you know, Doug Ford said, I'm going to slap a 25% export tax. And they, you know, had a back and forth where we saw this extraordinary joint statement between Doug Ford and Howard Lutnick, but that's the times we're in. Do you think if tomorrow isn't going to get the tariffs off steel and aluminum, do you think Premier Ford's going to slap that tax back on? Because that seems to have provoked the president, and you know, it's a potential inflection point again.
Premier Ford will make the decisions that he makes. I pointed out to Secretary Lutnick that he's a conservative premier who won a big majority government to take a tough position with this unfair attack on the Canadian economy in the context of his Ontario economy, but the same thing applies across the country. I spoke to Premier Ford today. I spoke to him yesterday. He has been a very effective advocate in the United States, in the American media, as well as domestically, in terms of why this is bad for consumers and the economy on both sides of the border. I won't speak. The Premier will decide what steps or what particular measures within his jurisdiction he wants to take. One thing that I've found encouraging, David, is all of the premiers, all 13 premiers, are very much focused on working together, have taken similar actions within their own jurisdiction, if it's removing American alcohol from the shelves, dealing with procurement. Premier of Nova Scotia, Tim Houston, my neighboring province, I thought took an innovative approach by deciding he's going to raise the tariffs, the tolls on the Cobequid Pass between New Brunswick and
the commercial
Nova Scotia
highway
on a commercial highway. So in their own jurisdiction, they're all doing things to try and show the Americans that this is an unreasonable step they're taking.
Right, but like taking the liquor off the shelves, while it's limited options for Canadians, and distillers and brewers in the U.S. have felt it didn't, the president didn't really respond to it. It was the electricity that did it. So would the government of Canada support the Premier of Ontario should he slap that export tax back on?
As I said, David, we don't propose to tell premiers of provinces, big or small, what they should do within their own sovereign jurisdiction. The Premier of Ontario, the Premier of Quebec, the Premier of my province, New Brunswick, they all have electricity contracts with American states or American consumers. They can decide how they want to approach that. I'm encouraged by the desire of all governments, all orders of government, including municipal, provincial, and the federal government, or territorial governments and the federal government, to try and put maximum pressure on the United States to see why this is unproductive and not particularly constructive. I said to Secretary Lutnick again today, like, Howard, we're on a race to the basement here, and there's no prize to get to the basement first. It's not good for their economy. It's not good for our economy. Consumers are going to feel this on both sides of the border, David. That's why it's difficult, and we think that it should stop as quickly as possible.
Yeah, but Howard Lutnick was a successful businessman, right? Cantor Fitzgerald, he was the head of that company. He understands how the economy works. He's seeing the economic self-harm this is inflicting on investment, on the stock market, where trillions of dollars have been wiped out. And now all of the historic and recent allies of the United States are angry at the United States. If those things don't convince them, because they're still strident from the White House podium, and the Oval Office, that this is the right way to go, it's just a painful transition to get what they want. Is it possible this is just what we've got to deal with while Donald Trump is in the White House?
I hope not, but I don't disagree with how you've characterized some of the last few weeks. My hope is that the pain that American consumers and American businesses will feel may make them take a different approach. If they want to have a coherent, sort of all-encompassing conversation about how we can build a strong North American economy that benefits Canada and the United States and our partner Mexico, of course, we're happy to have that discussion. But this sort of toilet seat up and down and up and down all the time isn't particularly constructive. But at the end of the day, one of the other things that has come from this confusion, David, is that I talked to small exporting companies in New Brunswick that manufacture wood, windows, and doors in the Skuduk Industrial Park near Shediac with 200 employees, unionized employees. The owner of that business is saying to me, like, how can I get help to diversify our markets, to look at other export opportunities? That's happening in big and small cases right across the country. That's a positive thing. The country will be less dependent on the American economy. We'll develop our own. Mr. Carney talks about one economy, not 13. I think Canadians understand what that means as well. But this won't solve the immediate problem next week. These are medium and longer term.
It's a positive thing, but it's a difficult transition. It's not necessarily going to go super fast.
And it won't solve the problem like literally this week.
But so we've got this, whatever happens with steel and aluminum, there is the April 2nd date for reciprocal tariffs, whatever that specifically means. There is a continental trade agreement in place that you would assume should cover all of this. So I know in the statements from Howard Lutnick that they want to rebalance CUSMA, USMCA, whatever you want to call it. He's talked about doing it in advance of April 2nd. There's not going to be a continental trade renegotiation between now and then. Where are things specifically on the idea of just moving past the tariff on and off and just recalibrating the formal trade arrangement to get through all of this?
So we think that's the ultimate landing spot, is to lift the tariffs that have applied to the Canadian economy and our retaliatory measures that apply to the American economy, and try and have that more concerted conversation, including with our Mexican partners. That's, we think, where these issues can properly be sorted out. Canada will go to that conversation with things that we want to improve in terms of the agreement. This is an agreement that President Trump in his first term negotiated and proclaimed that it was a great agreement. We think that we should start by respecting the terms of that agreement, as Canada has. And then if they want to have a respectful conversation around an economic partnership, we'd be happy to do that. But it can't be done while there's this back and forth, or some of the sort of insulting comments that come from various American leaders. That's not the way we're going to get to that sort of more productive conversation.
Okay, so on that, they continue with they continue with the 51st state. The argument that we'd all be better off if we just happily joined the United States and we'd have the lower taxes and the military protection. You're meeting with Howard Lutnick. At some point, Mark Carney or whoever wins the next election will have to meet with Donald Trump. Probably, right? Certainly G7, for sure. NATO, whatever, and to talk about this. Mark Carney said today he'd meet with Trump under a position where there is respect for Canadian sovereignty. What does that look like? So what has to happen before the Prime Minister-designate, when he's ultimately Prime Minister, meets the U.S. President? What does respect for Canadian sovereignty look like right now?
Well, I think Mr. Carney was clear in his leadership campaign that discussions, and on Sunday evening after his victory, in his speech, I thought he was also, again, very clear. Respect for our sovereignty starts with stopping the belittling reference to the Prime Minister of our country by another title. It stops pretending that somehow there's a sentiment in Canada that we should join the United States as the 51st state. None of that's true. Canada's a proud, independent country, a sovereign country, but can and should be the United States' most important economic and security partner, as we have been for decades. When President Reagan and the late Brian Mulroney negotiated the first free trade agreement 40 or 50 years ago, that was the basis of a shared prosperity. The security partnership goes back decades before that agreement. So that's where I think Canada can be, for the United States, a valuable partner. But this continuing sort of attempt to belittle or to insult the elected leaders of our country, or the overwhelming sentiment of Canadians. One of the reasons, David, why people stop me at the farmers market in Dieppe on a Saturday morning or at an airport and say that we have to stand up to this completely unreasonable action by President Trump and his government is precisely because they're insulted and they're emotionally affected by what is a series of sort of unacceptable comments that no previous president would have ever made.
So just one last question. Yesterday was a day of total chaos, right? Tariffs up to 50%, down to 25%, electricity tax on, electricity tax off. There's going to be a meeting. It's probably going to be an election very soon. How worried are you about the disruptive effect the U.S. administration and this trade war can have on a federal election here in Canada over the next 2 months?
Well, if there is, you're presuming that there's going to be an election in the next 2 months.
If you want to tell me Parliament's coming back, please break that news. It seems like it's not going to happen.
But it's cheap entertainment for you. Think of all the material you'd have for your show.
There's plenty of material, trust me. But do you think it could size with the election?
Well, we've also taken note that all the opposition leaders have said they need an election right away and they'll defeat the government at the first opportunity. So. Again, they can't be the fire chief and the pyromaniac. You don't get any credit for showing up with a hose when you started the fire.
No, I was worried about, you are going to Washington tomorrow.
Sure.
That's a harder thing to do in the middle of an election campaign. It's hard, it's caretaker convention. I know Doug Ford did it in Ontario, but they have no foreign policy responsibility. It's different with the federal government. It's going to be challenging.
It is, but it might also be important for the country to speak and to give a firm mandate to a government to deal with this massive disruption in our economic relationship. I think it's important, though, Canadians need to know, for example, if we get to April 2nd and we're in a writ period, so 2 hypotheticals. The third one would be, and we don't get an agreement to remove all of the tariffs with the United States and Canada. the government will absolutely have the authority to put in place the next $125 billion of retaliatory tariffs that we've talked about now for 3 weeks. So the instruments to continue to manage the economic affairs of the country remain in place during an election. But you're right, it's not the ideal time. It certainly isn't the ideal time to strike a more significant negotiation with a government like the United States.
Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Finance, good luck in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. You got a G7 economy depending on it, so thanks for being here today.
Thank you, David. We will not stand idly by while our iconic steel and aluminum industries are being unfairly targeted.
Well, it's day 8 of the trade war, and Canada has hit back against U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs. It's a package worth $30 billion against U.S.-made steel and aluminum, computers, sports equipment, and certain cast iron products. It comes one day before Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford head to Washington to talk trade with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. And as Donald Trump makes clear, he has no intention of changing course.
The United States of America is going to take back a lot of what was stolen from it by other countries. We're going to take back our wealth, and we're going to take back a lot of the companies that left.
So let's start there with the power panel. Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal National Campaign Director. Tim Powers has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties. And here with me in the studio, Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. Good to see you all. Michelle, let's start with you. What do you make of where we are right now in this trade war? Canada hit back today after the chaos of yesterday, and now a peace delegation is off to Washington on Thursday.
Well, I think that it is getting so complicated and so hard to keep up with, who's laying what tariffs down on what day. I think the bottom line is Donald Trump is still very concentrated on trying to destroy our economy. And he seems to be trying to do the similar for the world. As I've kind of trying to keep track of my chart, it seems that the European Union has kind of clapped back as well with retaliatory tariffs. And we did so too. Is he interested in peace? I think that, certainly Minister LeBlanc and Premier Ford are doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Going down there and trying to reason with these folks, trying to bring logic to some kind of an insane situation. But I'm unconvinced that there is anything that we could point to that suggests that he is open to an actual discussion or to any line of reasoning for his behavior or how he wants to move forward. It's baffling, and I guess that's the Prime Minister of Ireland who was subjected to the same kind of behavior today on a similar kind of rant. So, I'd like to be way more hopeful, but I think we just got to keep continuing doing what we're doing, and continue to fight back.
Tim, it's baffling. We should put that on the bottom of the screen and just leave it there nonstop until all of this is over, right? Because it is sort of difficult to understand exactly what's next and where it goes. But, Doug Ford took the export tax off on the electricity. If there's no change from the Americans tomorrow, do you think he should fire it back on? I mean, what do you think the Ontario Premier might do here?
Well, I'm sure he probably will fire it back on because there does seem to be some reaction. You did get a little bit of, if it was flattery from Trump saying, he liked the approach of the Ontario Premier. I'm paraphrasing here. Somebody could respect the strongman stuff. Look, responding seems to have some merit because what did we start yesterday at, David? 50? Now we're back to 25 where we were originally. Was that all the game? Who knows? I don't think we can take anything off the table until the Americans have backed down. I'm with, Team Canada in that particular approach, and I think the world has to take that particular approach. If you give into Trump, he's only going to try and get more, and as much uncertainty, destabilization, his goonery only works as long as you're allowed to be gooned around, and at a certain point, it'll be more than just markets crashing. You have to imagine that people in the states that are going to be affected by the reciprocal tariffs are going to say, or are affected by the our reciprocal tariffs are going to say, hey, enough is enough. But that's still going to take some time. So stay at him. Don't back down from this man.
Yeah, they're going down there on Thursday, Jordan. By Friday, it will be Prime Minister Kearney's job, as we understand that the swearing in of the transition will happen early on Friday at Rideau Hall, is what our sources are telling us. But in the hours between now and then, who knows what's going to happen, Jordan? So
there'll be at least 12 news cycles between now and then, I think.
Yeah, what do you think Canada, my question, I guess, is will Doug Ford put this back on? I don't know if he will or not, because, it seemed to provoke Donald Trump. It got his attention, but it did provoke him, and he did escalate. What do you think might happen?
I mean, look, I think that Doug Ford is likely going to be working in very close coordination with the Prime Minister designate, and that's as it should be. But there's no question that he got a reaction, and he succeeded in getting quicker attention, if you will, from the Americans than we've seen in a while. So I think it worked. And I would say that one thing that we're noticing over the last couple of weeks is that I think Canadians are in general feeling a lot more bullish on the response. I think people in the early days of these tariff threats were really mostly afraid, and now they're really mad. And I think that Doug Ford has been very successful in channeling a lot of that feeling. I think something that's also a little bit concerning is that we're seeing on the American side that the impact on the markets is not seeming to be the deterrent that a lot of people hoped that it would be for the Trump administration.
It's trillions that have been wiped out, though.
It's just been massive. And so that's a concerning thing. But, to build on what Michelle was saying, the good news, I think, is that Canada's not alone in this fight. We are uniquely exposed. There's no denying that. But the EU is moving quickly. They've got about 26 billion euros worth of retaliatory tariffs that are going to be coming into play. So the whole world is really sort of speaking out against these completely irrational actions that President Trump is taking. And we can only hope that we continue to hold his attention and become a problem that he wants to solve at the negotiating table.
Yeah, Cheryl, I think Jordan is dead right on Canadians are mad. I mean, you saw some reaction when Doug Ford said he was suspending the electricity tax. Like, no, raise it. If he's going to 50, you go to 50. And, we'll see what comes out of this. But it is a remarkable situation, this trade war happening in this time of political transition for the country to be in.
Yeah, I mean, taking the opposite of the Michelle Obama approach, when talking about tariffs, when they go high, we go higher. That's what people seem to really want to see right now.
Yeah.
But you also get the sense that you at least have the question of, is the fact that we have Mark Carney coming into the PMO, he sat down with Doug Ford. He had that first, conversation with him over, the table at the diner, as two, regular guys do, and then the tone did seem to shift. So is that coming from him? Is there a larger thing? Is something bigger at play? Is Doug Ford? He's not only pulling back on the surcharge on the electricity. He said he's also suspending the advertising campaign that they're doing down south as well. He said he's not backing down. He's respecting negotiations. He says that Mark Carney will have a better relationship with Donald Trump than Trudeau will, because they're both business people and they can talk to each other. Is he trying to smooth the path? There's all these things that you just don't know, because we don't know. We don't know what Mark Carney's relationship with Donald Trump is going to be. They haven't had a conversation. There was no congratulatory phone call, and the White House just said, well, the president's always open to hearing from them. So I guess he has to make the first move, apparently. There's a lot of unknowns here.
Yeah, I don't know if the phone calls happen until you're officially in office or not, right? I'm not sure how that works with the
Well, when Donald Trump won, everybody rushed to call
I know, but he doesn't follow, norms and rules don't work with him. But we don't know what's happening in those phone conversations between Doug Ford and Howard Lutnick. That's interesting that is happening at the subnational level, at the cabinet level. Speaking of U.S. cabinet officials, though, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's in Canada, and he says he is not planning to discuss Donald Trump's threat to take over Canada during the G7 meeting of finance ministers. Have a listen to what he had to say.
Can I ask you about the Canada trip coming up? The president has taunted, if you will, Canada calling the 51st state, calling Prime Minister
What he said
Trudeau
is it
governor.
should become the 51st state from an economic standpoint. He says if they became the 51st state, we wouldn't have to worry about the border and fentanyl coming across because now we would be able to manage that. He's made an argument that it's their interest to do so. Obviously, the Canadians don't agree, apparently. But
do you agree with this? Should they be? Are we going to discuss that becoming the?
Well, that's not what we're going to discuss at the G7, and that's not what we're going to be discussing in our trip here. So they're the host nation, and we have a lot of other things we work on together. We defend North America through NORAD and the airspace of our continent together. So not to mention the issues of Ukraine and other commonalities. So we're going to be focused in the G7 on all of those things. That's what the meeting is about. It is not a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada.
Well, thank God for that, Michelle. It's foreign ministers, not finance ministers, which is what I said, because I was thinking I had Dominic LeBlanc on the brain. What do you make of that there from Mark Carney? From Marco Rubio. Too much change in too little time and too many stories to follow. So, Michelle, I'm going to stop talking. Over to you.
Well, I think that, Marco Rubio, who I think the world has kind of gone upside down, who I'm now going to say is a note and is a voice of caution and kind of prudence somehow in the Trump White House, seems to understand that perhaps when you have to show your passport at the border and are coming to another country, that you should show them some respect. But at the same time, he doesn't have the guts to actually call a spade and how ridiculous his president is on the idea that they're going to take us over. Like, it's so disappointing in humanity, to be quite honest with you, that these people can't stand up for themselves and can't stand up to this man. But Canadians are standing up, and that gives me much more reassurance. And if anything, and I think Jordan might have said it earlier, Canadians are just mad now. And, the fright that might have been there in the early beginning in that trepidation is now kind of forming into a deep resistance and understanding that we can't let them walk all over us. The very idea that this is all about fentanyl is absurd. And, the agenda that he thinks that he has to try and take over our country is just not going to happen. And that only works if we all stand together and fight back. And so I'm pleased to see that the Team Canada approach is kind of taking that to heart.
Yeah, if only there was a period in recent history we could see what it meant to be a member of the Trump administration and the compromises you would have to make.